some of the actual details and how they remembered and what they mean to us. That happens, and it happens as the church fathers remembered the stories they heard about Jesus. I think they got the main idea right, even though maybe some of the details are fuzzy. I wish we had more righteous memories of Jesus growing up years. We've got this in the gospel, Luke chapter 2. After Jesus is born and after the flight to Egypt, we have this. Verse 40, verse 39. They returned to Galilee, to their own city called Nazareth, up here. The child, Jesus, continued to grow and become strong, increasing in wisdom, and the grace of God was upon him. And then again in verse 52, Jesus kept increasing in wisdom and stature, and in favor with God and man. That's it. But from this, we know that Jesus grew up physically. Went through all of those things that guys go through when they grow up physically. He increased in wisdom. Did I give you the best definition of wisdom that I've heard? Elmer Martins, of late, a Mennonite seminary professor, said that wisdom is skill in living. I like that. Skill in living. You don't have to get too religious, too holy to say that. Just skill in living. Living right. Jesus learned how to do that. And in favor with God and man. God was pleased as his son grew, and other people said, "My, what a fine boy that boy is." Probably said to their kids, "Why aren't you more like him when he's growing up?" Yeah, there are kids like that, right? That's not to say that Jesus was Superman or 1,000 IQ. We don't know. He was a normal kid growing up, but did things well. And Christian memory adds, I think correctly, according to the Gospels, without sin. Of course, we have to define what sin is. And I don't want to do that here, but he's doing it right. Jesus is. The only story we have of Jesus' growing up years is a story where Jesus goes to Jerusalem when he's 12 years old. And he's the age of becoming bar mitzvahed, of becoming an adult, or almost that age. And he goes down for the holiday, Jewish holiday, I think it's Passover. And he's with his mom and dad, and ends up in the temple talking to the guys in the temple. From this, and confounding them, saying things better than they are. From this, we know that he must have been educated, not just infused with divine knowledge, but he must have, whatever else this Nazareth village is, it's a village where he's got a chance to learn some things from the local priests, from the local scribes and rabbis. He's almost certainly literate enough to get by as well, reading Bible. And maybe a bit inquisitive, and in some contexts people would say precocious. Likes to get right in there and doesn't mind. So this much we can probably say. Beyond that, the Gospels are silent. And so we have what's called the infancy Gospel of Thomas. It's a book that didn't make it in the New Testament. The infancy Gospel of Thomas. And it tells stories about Jesus growing up, doing things sort of like he would do later, only like a kid would do it. So later, Jesus does miracles, and all the miracles are helpful miracles, where he touches people and heals them and meets their needs physically to help them spiritually and so on. So if you had that power and knew it when you were 8 years old, what would you do with it? Yeah. So the infancy gospel of Thomas says that when Joseph, his dad, was in the carpenter shop, he cut a piece of wood and he cut twice and measured once, right? And it was too short, and so Jesus says, "No problem, Dad." Takes the wood and stretches it to the right size. All right? Or, the boys are playing out here, and the birds fly by, and everybody's making little clay models of birds. And Jesus says, "Okay, now's my chance." Claps his hands, and his fly away. Right? These are in the infancy gospel of Thomas about Jesus. You can kind of see where they would come from. This precocious guy. I'm not sure that we can say that this is accurate. In fact, I'm pretty sure it probably isn't. I'm pretty sure it probably isn't. What could we do to reflect properly on Jesus' growing up years? What could we do? Well, we can use the geographical and archaeological data that we have to suggest some things. We can't prove anything. We can suggest it. And if you're going to suggest some things, at least look at the available data and say it's going to be within this package of what he could have done. And that context is the context that you can draw out from here. Now, some of that they see a blowing plastic bag.
Life is good.
Life is good. Yep. Now, some of that, Laura will help us see when we get to the next site. That whole package about him growing up, son of a, well, in English we say carpenter, don't we? I'll leave it at that. We'll have to see if maybe that's the best translation. And those relationships we'll do later. Is this not Jesus, son of Joseph the carpenter? That's the line we have in the gospel. Let's imagine this instead. And I'm looking, if you want, you can make a note or look if you want in your blue. You know why we call this the blue book? Yeah, we've done a new edition of it where the cover is white. Guess what we call it?
The blue book.
The blue book. Yep. People aren't going to know why. In 2 more printings, they're going to have no idea. Well, where's the page?
136.
You guys, it's 136. All right, this page, 136. Let's imagine, probably something like this might have happened. Jesus is about 10 years old. Growing up in wisdom and stature, he's got buddies. Yossi and these other guys are probably his buddies, whoever they are. We read that there's a synagogue in town, so let's say he goes to synagogue Friday night, Saturday morning. And then you got the whole Saturday, the whole Shabbat before there's more prayers in the late afternoon. So Jesus says to his mom, Mary, he says, can me and Yossi go up there again and play this afternoon? Now, the reason he said me and Yossi and not Yossi and I is because he's 10 years old and or a millennial. All right. So can me and Yossi go up? Can me and Yossi go up and can we play up there again? They're down in the basin, right? Where the church is now. And Mary says, yeah, just be back for dinner time. We've got, Shabbat prayers. Won't say Shabbat prayers that we have to do. Oh, you might get hungry. Let me give you a lunch. 5 loaves, 2 fish, something, right? gives him a lunch. And they come up on this ridge. There's no way Jesus didn't wander this ridge as a kid. It's too good of a view, right? So they come up here, and Yossi says to Jesus, okay, let's do that story again. And this time Jesus says, okay, but this time I get to be Barak and you can be Deborah. Or something like that. What happened in your hometowns? Those of you growing up. You all grew up. The town where you grew up in. What happened in your hometown? Some of you say nothing, right? Is there one little claim to something? Probably not. Maybe. Maybe. What happened in Jesus' hometown when he was growing? Nothing. Because it's a brand new town. There's no evidence, archaeological evidence of anything before the 1st century. It's a brand new scrappy town. Not much going on there. But all he has to do is walk up to this steep south-facing ridge. And now what's he looking into?
Looking into the travel
He-
down the Jezreel Valley.
He's looking into the Jezreel Valley, thank you.
See all the transportation.
He's looking into the Jezreel Valley, and that's a Bible name. And he's looking at hills on the other side of the Jezreel Valley that have names that are Bible, that are Old Testament names, for which we have Old Testament stories. Some of them are listed on this map. From this ridge, Jesus looks deep into his own past, his own people's past, his own identity of the past. And he can see locations where things happened that are talked about in his Bible. We call it Old Testament. So looking out here, specifically, what stories do you see? George Adam Smith, the historical geographer who talked about those hills from Herodian looking like the waves of the sea, talked about this as a great stage with its entrances and exits where people come and go. It's a great image. I prefer it's shaped like a baseball diamond and all of that, but never mind. Great stage where people come and go. Specifically, what stories do you think you can see? And the reason I ask it is not a trivia question, but because of this. Jesus is growing up in wisdom and stature, learning how to be a proper human being, and part of that context is learning how to be a good Jewish boy. A lot of Christians want to make Jesus a fine Christian gentleman. When I grew up, he wore a suit and a narrow tie, Jesus did. Cut his hair like Richard Nixon, you know? And always gave his offering plate after the sermon about himself or something, right? You know, people want to make Jesus into a liberation theologian, into Che Guevara or Mahatma Gandhi or something. Guess what? He was a fine Jewish boy. We need to understand him in that context. And as he's growing up, this Galilee, this international Galilee region, this region with the great trade routes of Greek and Roman worldview coming through it, an opportunity coming through it, are causing the Jews who are living here to say, many of them to say, enough. What we need to do is revolt against the Roman political power. We need to get our own independence back so that Jerusalem can revive and once again have the full freedom of us in our own independent state. All right? So you have little messiahs standing up and saying, I'll do it, I'll lead the revolt against Rome, all across the Galilee when Jesus is growing up. We know the names of some of them. And as Jesus is growing up in wisdom and stature and feels the anointing upon him, he's looking into his own past, his own people's past, and events in this valley, and saying, wow, what can I learn from, pick from, use from? Of all of the possible ways of being effective, which one am I going to choose? That's the question. So you look into the valley, you look at the map, you look at the stories that you know. Give me a couple of examples. Who does he see out here that he can pattern himself after? Anybody want to guess one or two?
David.
No. Abraham, no story of Abraham in this valley. No story of David in this valley. No story of Moses in this valley.
Noah.
No story of no. In this no.
What?
No story of Samson. You got a whole page here. I'm giving them to you on 136. Let me give you some examples. Let me give you some examples. They may or may not be in chronological order. but they're stories you know, and let me give you some. All right? One of them is the story of a man who was called Messiah, anointed one, more often than anybody else in Hebrew Bible in Old Testament. When you just add up the words, there's a guy, one person who has that title more than anybody else, and it wasn't David. It was King Saul. David kept saying, I'm not going to harm God's anointed one. It was King Saul. King Saul was the first king of ancient Israel. And the narrative that we have is a bit mixed, actually. Toward the beginning of his life, he was very effective. Toward the end of his life, not so much. And Samuel the prophet anointed David to be king instead. They were living at the same time and had a little bit of conflict between them. And at the end of Saul's life, Saul has a crown prince named Jonathan. And at the end of Saul's life, Saul comes up to fight the Philistines who have come through this valley and camped out just on the left shoulder of and the other side of this mountain, Mount Moriah. And they've camped out there, and what they've done is they separated the Israelites on this side from the ones on that side. You call that gutting them in the middle, separating the two. And Saul is going to meet the Philistines in battle, and before the battle, he walks himself over right on the, you see the high point where the tower is, right? It goes down and flat and goes down again. And you see where it goes down again? There's some trees there at the base. That's a place called Endor, where Saul goes at night and meets a medium, a witch, and says, am I going to win or not? And basically the witch says, you're going down, bud. It's basically the story, right? Saul goes back the next day, fights. He loses his life. His son, the crown prince, lose their life. And the Philistines come and split the kingdom. Now you tell me what that means. When your kingdom is, the geography is split, the king is gone, and the crown prince is gone. What do you call that? Put a big period, it's over. Right? It's done. The man the Bible called in the Old Testament Messiah more than anything else. Is that the kind of Messiah that Jesus wants to be? When he considers the past, look what can happen to these guys. Right? Maybe we should pretend we're doing another story, he says to Yosef, right? What other stories do we have out here? Some of them are more obscure than others. I heard somebody say Elijah. Elijah is a guy we'll talk about in a couple of days. He's growing up on the other side, up in Gilead. Elijah is a prophet who kind of comes in the spirit of what you ought to think a prophet ought to look like. Kind of a rough guy off the frontier who goes toe-to-toe with the political and probably religious authorities. He himself has no standing in society other than what God gave him. And he's got the guts to go eyeball to eyeball with King Ahab and Jezebel. He meets the prophets of Baal up on Mount Carmel, which we saw when we were on the top. We'll go there in a couple of days. And King Saul is not very effective, but Prophet Elijah is, calling into account. You know, we all want prophets today as long as they say what we think needs correcting. Yeah? Elijah said other things. Maybe that's who I should be. Who else do we have out here? Anybody else? We've got a guy named Gideon, a judge who fights a battle this is Mount Moriah. The one off the right shoulder is Mount Gilboa. And Gideon fights a battle between the two against a group of invaders from the east. Who was Gideon growing up? He was just a guy. He was a farmer. He was the son of a farmer. He was a young guy. He was a bit of a timid guy. We read in the early story, Just a guy from a small little squatty town. We don't even know where it is, over there someplace. And God picked him up and said, you're going to be the general who's going to drive out the enemy, and he did. With just a small army himself in the faith of God. Small little squatty town, just a guy. Maybe I can do that too, Jesus says. Maybe I can be the military Messiah that actually works this time. Yeah? I wonder if the idea ran through his head. Down here you've got Deborah and Barak. Barak is just a guy. Deborah was a lady prophet from down by Bethel, down by Jerusalem. And they fought against another Jabin, king of Hatzor. Huge chariot battle right before you in this part of the Jezreel Valley. Judges chapters 4 and 5. And just the guy and just the prophet lady were able to, with the intervention of God, it was a thunderstorm, defeat the chariot army, the great chariot army of the Canaanites. Maybe just regular people did that. Isn't that great? You know? I mean, who was Bill Gates at the beginning, right? You know? Can I use, yeah, who said to his dad, can I use the garage? I've got an idea, you know? Just a guy. Or Elisha. Here's one for you. The successor of Elijah. Again, from a town over here on this end. In the Elisha narratives, a prophet who went about the towns and villages doing good. Towns and villages doing good. What was Jesus' first miracle? Sorry. What was Elisha's first miracle once he got the cloak of authority from Elijah? He went to Jericho. The water was bad. Literally, there was a miscarriage in it. The water was bad. Elisha made it potable, able to drink. What was Jesus' first miracle?
Water.
He took water that was already potable and made it even better. Yeah? You know what Elisha did? Elisha had a group of maybe 30, 40 people. They didn't have enough food to give them. And he was able to multiply the bit that he had for the crowd. Jesus did the same thing twice to a multitude. Elisha, we read in 2 Kings, was walking along the Jordan riverbank, and a man was trying to chop down some trees. The axe head fell into the water and sank. Elisha made it float. Jesus made an entire person walk on the water. Some connections here. And Elisha, when he used to walk from his hometown on the far side over to Mount Carmel, halfway, exactly halfway, is the end of this mountain you see here, the Moreh Mountain. There's a village there named Shunem, a childless couple. And they made a place for Elisha to stay on the roof. And Elisha then said, God will smile upon you as a couple, and you will have a child. And sure enough, within a year or so, they had a boy who grew up in wisdom and stature, and who was helping his dad in the wheat field, and had heat stroke and died when he was a lad. Likely he forgot his water bottle that day. All right? And Elisha came, put the boy on his bed, stretched out upon him, and breathed into him the breath of life, and the boy came alive again. And we read in the Gospel of Luke that Jesus went over here to this mountain. Shunem no longer exists, but there's a town called Nain on the very same mountain. Just here to the left, it's kind of midpoint there. Just when the only son of a lady is being brought out to be buried. And Jesus says, stop, and breathes into him the breath of life, and the boy is alive. And you know what the people say? A great prophet has arisen among us. Because they remember the other story. And the power of God is back. We track narratives of what Jesus did or what he could have perhaps thought to do. And we need to allow Jesus to have choices. What kind of Messiah should I be? Where is the real need out here? Should I be a king? Should I lead a revolt? like these other messiahs who I'm related to, great, 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 grand, whatever, yeah? Or should I do something else? Perhaps the most tragic one is this. Over here at Megiddo. We're going to be at Megiddo. It's behind this behind this first clump of trees. Now the breeze feels good with the sun. We've got the greatest, probably the greatest, potentially the greatest king that Israel ever had. A guy named Josiah. We read about him toward the end of the book of Kings. He did everything right in the book of Kings. Strong king, strong economy, strong leadership, strong society, strong temple, strong politics. I mean, on every possible level, it was working. And the kingdom was starting to expand. And he was right at the age where you're old enough to know what to do and still young enough to get it done. He was 39, all right? He was right at that age. Back then, life expectancy was less. And he meets the Pharaoh of Egypt, Necho, in battle at Megiddo, and an arrow goes all the way through him. And he's taken back to Jerusalem in his chariot. Probably every time the chariot hits a bump on the rock, he says, "Why did I do this?" And he dies in Jerusalem. And the greatest possible moment in ancient Judah's history is snatched. Yeah. And Israel is looking for a leader. If the best possible leadership that we can create internally can be snatched in a moment, what can we do? And Jesus says, well, maybe there's something divine that needs to happen. Yeah? He's growing in wisdom and stature, how to live correctly, how to do it right. Now let's read something out of Luke 4, and then we can go back to the bus. Luke chapter 4. Verse 16. Jesus has already started what we call his adult ministry. You know, when we get to Capernaum, we'll have to really kind of poke at this a little bit. I wonder if he ever stopped carpentering. I'm going to suggest he never stopped. But whatever he's doing here, going around doing good in the villages, he's starting that. He's left home. And already been to Cana, already been to Capernaum. And he comes back to Nazareth, verse 16 of Luke 4, where he had been brought up. He's about 30 years old. And it was his custom, he goes into the synagogue. It's Shabbat. That's today, by the way. So it's a nice verse to read. He goes into the synagogue. We've not found the building. Maybe it was a home church. You know what I mean? Just a spot where people meet. We've not found the building. Some we found, but not from this town. He stands up to read. You stand to read, you sit to speak. That's why in Matthew 5, the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus sat down, his disciples came to him. They knew he had something to say. He stood to read. The book of the prophet Isaiah was handed to him. Remember that Laura mentioned that the Qumran Dead Sea Scrolls, the three most common books in the Dead Sea Scrolls, are Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. The three most common books quoted in the New Testament of the Old are Psalms, Deuteronomy, and Isaiah. They're all very messianic in context. And he finds in the book the prophet Isaiah, handed to him, he opens the book, finds the place where it was written, and now he reads. And I need a volunteer to read. You can read from mine. I need a volunteer to read. All right, I'm going to have you read it twice. All right, I'm going to have just the red print here.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me,
because he anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord.
Something's happening in these verses. I'm going to have you read it again in just a minute. John, right? Don. Okay. I ride. It's close. Most people who read this talk about these social service things that are going on here. Talking to the poor, releasing the captive, sight to the blind. These kinds of things that Jesus did in terms of miracles and so on. Rather than focus on that, I want to focus on the pronoun. The word me. I want you to read it again. You read it like everybody reads it. This time I want you to emphasize you're Jesus speaking about yourself. So I want you to emphasize the pronoun, the me, so that people know that you're talking about you.
The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to set free those who are oppressed, to proclaim the favorable year of the Lord.
You can add a few more me's in there as you go, right? But you get the idea. And all eyes are looking at him intently. He says, the scripture today has been fulfilled. Everybody does this. And probably everybody's running through their mind. Maybe another Gideon. Maybe Deborah and Barak. Maybe an Elisha is back. What's happening? And he says, everybody says good things about him in verse 22. Gracious words dripping out of their lips. Wouldn't you like people to do that about you, right? No, it's just dribble, but something. Gracious words coming up. Isn't this the son of Joseph? And Jesus says, look, there's a proverb. Physician, heal yourself. You've heard I've been doing amazing things out there. You just want me to do fun stuff with you too. Prophets aren't welcome at home. And now he gives two examples. I say to you truly, verse 25, in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the sky was shut and a 3-year drought and people were starving, many widows who had no one to provide for them, Elijah went to Zarephath in the land of Sidon to help her. Why doesn't he help his own people? What is the land of Sidon? This is where Jezebel comes from. Jezebel, who is corrupting the heart and soul of Israel, and that's why there's a famine. And Elijah goes to her own hometown to help the foreigner. And then he says this. When Elisha was prophet, a lot of people had leprosy. Leprosy is a disease that the rabbi says you can't enter the temple with it. And so it was kind of one of these quarantine diseases. And isolated you, exiled you from your own people. That's the worst thing to happen in the ancient world. Not to die, but to be exiled. And leprosy did that. And there are many lepers. And who did Elisha heal? Naaman the Syrian. Who are the Syrians? The people in Damascus who are sending the chariots down across the Golan. And whenever you find them, they're down here putting Israel in tremendous famine. There are stories of famine here caused by the Syrians in siege warfare where people are eating the dung of pigeons because there's nothing else to eat. That's what the Syrians are causing. And Naaman was the general in charge of the fight on behalf of the Syrians, and that's who Elisha heals. It's in Luke 4. So what do you think the people up here in this small village who are interested in throwing out Rome think about Jesus' examples? They don't like it. They don't like it. And immediately they get angry. They drive him out of the city. They lead him to the brow of the hill to throw him down. And we read, but passing through their midst, he goes his way. And the local Nazareth people say he jumped to get off the edge. And being God, he floated down and was saved. So Jumping Mountain. You thought it was Lover's Leap. Jumping Mountain. All right, Jumping Mountain in local tradition. And then leaves Nazareth, and we're going to pick him up later this afternoon, heading toward Capernaum. I'll let you make your own conclusions as to how to relate that to today. Whose name you might put in there instead of the widow of Zarephath or name in the Syrian. None of those names are comfortable. And what we find is that of all of the things Jesus could have been, he's choosing to be the prophet. The prophet. Yes, there's royalty. Yes, there's kingship. Yes, there's priesthood. He fulfilled those roles. But his activity day by day is the prophet. Where the prophets go about the villages, they do good, they touch, and they heal. And when there's authority to be challenged, they'll go eyeball to eyeball. And they'll do it. And Jesus does all of this. Wisdom and stature he grows up in the arena here. And he and Yosef go back to Mom that night, and they do their synagogue prayers, and Jesus says, I got to be Barak today. Yossi had to be Deborah. And continues to grow and learn and so on. All right. We're going to meet him in another town next. And then have lunch and then head